Tortured on the Gurney, Alan Eugene Miller's failed execution and the fight for reform. Imagine being strapped onto a gurney, repeatedly stabbed with needles, and left hanging vertically, bleeding and terrified. This isn't the plot of a grim crime movie. It's the real-life story of Alan Eugene Miller, a 57-year-old inmate in Alabama. Miller is not just any prisoner. He is the only known survivor of a failed lethal injection in the United States. His case is filled with haunting details of physical pain and mental anguish, sparking outrage and raising profound questions about the humanity of capital punishment. Today we unravel his ordeal, igniting a conversation about justice, reform, and the value of human dignity. Alan Eugene Miller was convicted for the 1999 workplace shootings of 3 co-workers in Alabama. For his heinous crime, Miller was sentenced to death, marking the start of a legal battle that would span decades. But beyond the conviction lies a more profound question. Can justice ever justify torture, even against those guilty of taking lives? The crime that sealed Miller's fate was shocking, yet what followed was an even grimmer tale of systemic flaws. September 20, 2022 was the night scheduled for Alan Eugene Miller's execution via lethal injection. By midnight, the scene at Holman Correctional Facility turned into one of unimaginable horror. Prison staff and execution officials were faced with a grim procedural failure, one that blurred the lines between state-sanctioned death and outright torture. As Miller lay strapped to the gurney, staff struggled to insert an IV necessary for the lethal injection. They poked him repeatedly with needles for over an hour, targeting his arms, legs, hands, and feet. Flashlights from officials' phones illuminated the grueling scene, turning him into a living human pincushion. The physical pain was one thing, the mental agony quite another. This wasn't swift, clinical execution. It was chaos. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, the horrors escalated. In an attempt to stabilize him, Miller was strapped upright onto a gurney and left hanging there for nearly 20 minutes. Witnessing his helplessness and abandonment through a glass wall, state officials deliberated his fate. Blood trickled from the needle wounds scattered across his body, staining both his clothing and his so-called humanity. For Miller, the lines between life and death blurred in those agonizing moments. He wasn't merely facing execution. He was enduring what his lawyers would later call torture at the hands of a system meant to swiftly and humanely deliver justice. Then came the abrupt end to the ordeal, a loud knock from officials signaling the cancellation of the execution due to time constraints on their death warrant. The gurney was lowered, but Miller was left physically and emotionally shattered, scarred by an experience he could never forget, and nor should we. What makes this story more harrowing is that it could have been avoided. Alan Eugene Miller had previously appealed for execution through nitrogen hypoxia, a method he believed would be less traumatic due to problems with locating his veins. Despite his appeal, Alabama opted for lethal injection, perhaps underestimating the complexities tied to his medical condition. Nitrogen hypoxia, though less common, eliminates the need for intravenous access. For Miller, whose veins were compromised, this could have spared him the nightmarish ordeal. Yet the state held its ground, eventually failing to follow through with its chosen method. The result? A public display of a flawed system, indifferent to both the physical and moral consequences of its decisions. Alan Eugene Miller's case isn't isolated. Alabama has a disturbing record of botched executions over recent years, shedding light on broader systemic shortcomings. Publicized cases of failed and prolonged lethal injections generate controversy, drawing attention to the cruel inefficiencies of these methods. Critics argue that Alabama's lack of transparency and preparation in implementing executions has led to scenarios that clearly violate the Eighth Amendment, protection against cruel and unusual punishment. Miller's case is merely the latest chapter in this unfolding saga of inhumanity. As the dust settles, Alan Eugene Miller wears an unsettling label, the United States' first execution survivor. His lawyers describe his current state as one filled with both physical and emotional trauma. The wounds inflicted during the procedure have become more than just scars on his body. They are a testament to the psychological torment he endured that night. Imagine living with the knowledge that the state, the law, and the system failed in its attempt to end your life. Imagine stepping back into a death row cell where you await yet another fatal appointment. This is the grim reality for Alan Eugene Miller, one that isn't just personal, but a reflection of an institutional failure. Alan Eugene Miller's legal team continues their fight, determined to prevent another scheduled execution attempt. They argue that the torture he endured violates the Constitution, calling for greater accountability and a halt to the process once and for all. The case is now not just about Miller, it's about the integrity of the justice system. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. What happens when the system designed to uphold justice becomes a source of inhumane suffering? And how do we prevent state-sanctioned acts of cruelty from tarnishing our collective morality? At the heart of the debate lies the Eighth Amendment. Miller's lawyers describe the ordeal as unnecessary and wanton infliction of pain, explicitly prohibited under the U.S. Constitution. The question of constitutionality is not simply procedural. It is fundamental to the nature of justice in a society that prides itself on freedoms and human rights. Does the state's right to punish include the right to cause prolonged pain and suffering? The answer, as we see, is far murkier than it appears. The failed execution of Alan Eugene Miller highlights critical global debates about the morality of capital punishment. While many countries have abolished the death penalty for being inhumane, incidents like Miller's case paint a troubling picture of the United States' adherence to this controversial practice. As international human rights organizations watch closely, the handling of Miller's case is key to understanding whether the U.S. legal system can strive for reform or persist in defending practices that often walk a fine line between justice and cruelty. For an audience immersed in true crime, Alan Eugene Miller's story brings a haunting twist to familiar narratives. Unlike countless stories of victims and perpetrators, it focuses on the frailty of the justice system itself. It reminds us that humanity, even in the form of legal punishment, is not infallible. More importantly, it connects on an emotional level. The man strapped to that gurney was not merely a convicted criminal, he was someone subjected to a system that failed to uphold even its own standards. Miller's case has galvanized human rights activists and advocacy groups to call for systemic reform. The death penalty cannot simply be seen as a sentence. It is a responsibility, one requiring utmost care and consideration. His ordeal is a call to action for policymakers to address glaring deficiencies in protocol and treatment. Public outcry and discussions like this one add weight to the push for change. The voices of individuals, advocacy groups, and audiences like you hold the potential to challenge the status quo. At its core, Alan Eugene Miller's story forces us to grapple with a simple yet profound question. Where should the line be drawn between justice and inhumanity? Can we enact punishment without compromising our ethical integrity? His plight isn't one for pity but for action, a demand that we acknowledge the flaws in the system and push for meaningful change. If justice is to prevail, it must do so with fairness, dignity, and humanity intact. Alan Eugene Miller's harrowing journey through a failed execution exemplifies the cracks in a justice system tasked with the gravest responsibility of all. Beneath his story lies a warning, a reminder of what happens when humanity is overlooked in the pursuit of justice. He is no longer just an inmate or a convict. He is a survivor, a symbol, and an advocate for reform. It is now our collective responsibility to ensure that his suffering sparks tangible change. True justice, after all, is not defined by cruelty or incompetence, but by compassion and the pursuit of a better future. This somber, detailed script provides a nuanced exploration of Miller's case while keeping the true crime audience captivated and engaged.